I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson, and delighted to welcome everyone to today's conference. And let me just, at the absolute outset, note for those of you who haven't been here for a few weeks, we've actually now gone through a new logo of Hudson, and we have a brand new redone website, which we're all quite proud of at www.hudson.org. So I urge all of you to look at it. Lots of articles on the situation in Ukraine. We're especially pleased to be doing this conference with the Danube Institute and our former colleague and very good friend John O'Sullivan, about whom I'll have a few words in a moment. And we're honored by the presence of Ambassador Saspari of Hungary here with us this morning, as well as David Satter of Hudson, and also at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, a great hero, first American journalist to be expelled from Russia since the end of the Cold War. And we're also honored to have former Undersecretary of State Paula Dobriansky with us, great leader in the fight against communism, and someone who's been omnipresent in the media and everywhere in the last week or so as the situation has, last couple of weeks, as the situation has unfolded in Ukraine. Let me simply say, by brief introduction, the Russian invasion of Crimea is certainly the most disturbing action Russia has taken on the European continent since its invasion of Georgia 6 years ago, but arguably since its invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. This shocking action is, as all of us know, a wanton violation of the sovereignty of a democratic nation, military aggression that stands in violation of the Helsinki Final Act and the UN Charter. The flimsy pretext for which it was undertaken, protecting Russian-speaking minorities in Ukraine, now raises the specter, as my colleague Doug Feith has written in the Wall Street Journal, of Russian interventions in numerous nations, especially NATO ones, particularly in the Baltics, for the same reason. This crisis poses an immense challenge to the Transatlantic Alliance, divided as it is among those who would prefer more vigorous action against the Russians, while others prefer a slower and, shall we say, more diplomatic engagement to handle the matter. For those of us who have followed the situation closely here in Washington and who are quite concerned about the fate of this region of the world, have also, I should note, been disturbed for some time by a rather weak and at times vacillating American policy towards Russia that has emerged since 2009. What are the levers that the West has at its disposal at this time? Is it even appropriate to speak of the West, divided as we are, under an Obama presidency that has failed to make the moral case for the Transatlantic Alliance? And what in particular is the legacy of the former Soviet bloc states of Middle Europa, the Visegrad nations, whose historical memory of Russian invasion remains quite vivid? To examine these and other questions, we have an all-star lineup with us today for a very comprehensive program, and one that in particular will focus on what the states of Central Europe can do in the midst of this enormous crisis. That being said, by way of introduction, I'm honored, delighted to introduce my friend and former colleague, John O'Sullivan, who now directs the Danube Institute in Budapest. John needs no introduction in Washington. Former speechwriter and aide to the late British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. John is editor-at-large at the National Review, former vice president and executive editor at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and as we all know, a brilliant observer of culture, international affairs, and politics in his columns that we get to read in the National Post, the National Review, and many other fine publications. And so with that, let me turn it over to John, and let's give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. On behalf of the Danube Institute, let me welcome everyone here to this conference as well. It is, of course, for me a great personal pleasure to be back at Hudson, not only because of the kind words that Ken delivered about me just a moment ago, but also because I spent 3 very happy years here as a senior fellow, happy unproductive years. It was here where I wrote my book on the Pope, the President, and the Prime Minister, about Reagan, Thatcher, and the Pope, and the role they played in bringing down communism and establishing a new world fairly peacefully. It's a great pity that that new world now seems to be somewhat less peaceful and more contested than we thought only a few years ago. But it's obviously something which institutes like Hudson and like the Danube Institute will have to turn our attention to very seriously. Now, I'll just say a few words about the Danube Institute. Since most of you won't know about us, we are very new. We are based in Budapest, although we cover really the whole of Central Europe, and we have three purposes. We aim to be a centre for debate between conservatives and classical liberals in Central Europe. We aim, secondly, to be a focus of debate between conservatives and classical liberals on the one hand, and their democratic opponents on the other. We tend to feel that in the region we're talking about, there's too much partisanship and not enough debate. And we think that the way towards a more, less partisanship rather, is a more open, generous and connected debate between all parties. And as I say, that's our second purpose. Our third is we want to provide a transmission belt for ideas and for arguments and for people from Central Europe to Western Europe and the English-speaking world in particular, obviously, to the United States and North America. And this conference is, from one standpoint at least, an example of that new transmission belt, and we hope for great things from it. Now, the genesis of this conference really emerged in the very first instance from a conversation that Ambassador Zapari and I had at our very first conference in Budapest. And that was an agreement that the developments in Central Europe of a hopeful kind, namely movements towards greater cooperation between the countries in the Visegrad Four, the movements by the European Union to develop a stronger partnership with Eastern and Central Europe, and new ideas like the Carpathian Initiative deserved greater attention. In other words, our initial impulse was a relatively hopeful one to draw attention in Western Europe and the United States to the somewhat the greater cooperation that was developing in that region. Now, we saw this in relation to the Ukraine crisis, which was at a relatively early stage, in a rather hopeful way. Asking ourselves, what way could this new cooperation help to avert a crisis in the Ukraine that was developing? Well, of course, that our conference is taking place after the crisis has become far more acute, and I would like to just associate myself with the description of that crisis and the criticism of Russian behavior that Ken Weinstein just advanced. But the result of it has been, of course, that we've been redesigning the conference almost daily to take account of the new developments. And I think we have done so very successfully, and I'm looking forward to this morning. Now, having said that, I think a sensible thing for me to do, since I'm an observer rather than an expert on the Ukraine, is to say a few words introducing my old colleague David Satter and then depart the stage. David I have known for about 25 years. I met him first when he was the Financial Times correspondent in Moscow. He's since been a correspondent there for the Wall Street Journal as well. He has written a number of powerful and important books about the end of communism and the development of the new kind of state and society, which is neither capitalist nor communist, but, well, it has kleptocratic elements and authoritarian elements, and I suspect I'm waiting for David's next book to get a complete analysis of the new kind of post-Soviet Russian society that is emerging, but it is certainly not the society we hoped would emerge. And secondly, David has not only written powerful books on this question, but he is well, I suppose the only begetter of an important film, which recently won the documentary award at the Amsterdam Film Festival. I'm particularly happy to mention this film, The Age of Delirium, based upon his book, because I played a role of a godfather in helping to bring it to life. He found himself at a certain stage of the process without the production facilities he needed to complete it, and we at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty were very happy, as I was then there, to help him to do that. That's a powerful film. If you haven't seen it, I urge you to try to do so. David will perhaps mention where you can. But having said that, I think we're getting in David somebody who has an intimate knowledge, a deep knowledge, and a very unique perspective on the development of the Russian state. And he comes directly, so to speak, hot foot, like a good journalist from Ukraine, from Kiev, from the Maidan, where he witnessed some of the events that began this latest acute phase of the Ukraine crisis. I look forward to what he has to say and to learning from it. David Satter.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks to all of you for coming. Are the microphones working? Are they? Yes? Okay. It is true that I'm recently from Ukraine, and recently, in fact, from Russia, where I was expelled as a correspondent, and have the honor of being the first American correspondent expelled from Russia since the end of the Cold War. Both Ukraine and Russia share, as we know, the heritage of communism, which in its essence, I think, resulted in the destruction of a sense of individual morality. The idea that the individual is responsible for his actions, that he's capable of moral judgment, that he ought to be guided in what he does by that judgment. This may seem, on the one hand, like a very mundane and obvious observation, and on the other hand, as rather an irrelevant one. But in fact, it's neither, because it's the key, I think, to understanding what's going on in Ukraine now. It's the key to understanding the Russian reaction to what's happening in Ukraine. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the entire region underwent a dramatic change in economic structures. We witnessed in a very short time the transition from a state-run and state-owned economy to an economy in which there was a form of private ownership. But the transitional process was flawed. It wasn't guided by law, and it was certainly not guided by any moral considerations. The result was that what took place in many of the former Soviet republics, many of the countries which emerged from the Soviet Union, was really an intensive process of negative selection, in which the most ruthless, the most unethical, the greediest, and the most cunning rose to the top. This was the case in Russia, and it was the case in Ukraine. The result of this situation is that the necessary moral revolution that needed to take place after the fall of communism, because communism was, in a way, an exercise in moral sterilization. People were told that the only thing that really mattered was the judgment of the party. And under those circumstances, there really was no role for individual conscience. And it was in this atmosphere of moral confusion that both Ukraine and Russia failed to establish the rule of law. The situation with Viktor Yanukovych, the recently overthrown president of Ukraine, absolutely exemplified this situation. In a society without values and without any kind of strong moral orientation, greed is the only driver of behavior. And the leaders in the post-Soviet world, and certainly Yanukovych typified this, could think of nothing better to do with themselves than simply to steal, to accumulate, to rob, to make sure that under no circumstances could they ever be removed from office. Yanukovych became one of the richest people in the world, and he did so by using the institutions of the state in order to appropriate property. Came into power after elections which, although dubious by the standards of the region, were relatively legitimate because there were no very visible and egregious examples of falsification that could be put on the internet, which isn't to say that they didn't take place. But once in power, he began to rule in a totally lawless manner. The institutions of the state were used by Yanukovych and by the members of his family in order to simply distribute the property that had been distributed, albeit also unfairly, in the first wave of privatization in Ukraine. The difference in this case was if the previous privatization had produced a slew of unethical oligarchs, now the Yanukovych phase 2 privatization in Ukraine was an attempt to concentrate enormous wealth in the hands of Yanukovych's personal cronies and the members of his family. And the leader of this effort was Yanukovych's own son, Alexander, a dentist with no previous business experience, who in 3 years became a multi-billionaire. When Yanukovych was asked how it was possible that the young man who had no previous connection to big business had become so wealthy so fast, he said he's just very talented. Well, the secret to his talent was very clear to everybody in Ukraine. The administrative apparatus of the country was turned against anyone who refused to sell out or hand over their business at a dictated price. The scenario, which was repeated again and again, was that representatives of Yanukovych, of his family, of his cronies, of his son. His son's apparently a sociable guy. He has a circle of friends who also engage in these practices. Would offer a price usually far below the fair market price for a business. The businessman in question would be led to understand that it was in his best interest to sell at that price. If he refused, then the process began of forcing him to sell. First stage of the process was to send the sanitation inspector, fire inspector, the police, the tax inspectors to find violations, which they did without difficulty, both real and imaginary violations, and impose fines so draconian that it would be impossible to stay in business. And if that wasn't enough to convince the businessman that he was best off complying with the conditions that were suggested to him, he could be simply arrested on trumped-up charges. Result was that the biggest oligarchs in Ukraine were the members of Yanukovych's family or his cronies, or those like Rinat Akhmetov, who had been traditional oligarch, but who rose up out of the organized crime environment in the Donetsk Oblast and was Yanukovych's early sponsor. What this meant for the average citizen was that no one could be secure, because the very conditions that were necessary in order to make it possible for this concentration, this rapid concentration of wealth in the hands of those who exercise political power, also meant that there could be no reliable legal mechanism sufficient to protect the rights of individuals. So they were what we saw in Ukraine was the same thing that exists in Russia, just as two sides of one coin. On the one hand, the massive and seemingly endless accumulation of wealth by those with political power, and the lack of legal rights and lack of legal protections of those who lack that power. In Ukraine, there were a couple of very dramatic episodes which illustrated for people what this meant. Two women, two separate cases, but nonetheless very similar, were assaulted, raped, and savagely beaten. One of the women died. These were in provincial areas, not outside of Kyiv, but the whole country heard about them, heard about these cases. In the one instance, the victims were, the perpetrators were members of the local police force. In the other instance, they were children of the local elite. But what the cases illustrated for everyone was that the authorities are free to do anything they want, and no one has any protection against them. In the months that preceded the decision on November 30th not to sign an association agreement with the European Community, it was widely expected in Ukraine that Ukraine would in fact affiliate. And Yanukovych and his entourage gave repeated indications that that was the path that was going to be pursued. And then suddenly on November 30th, it was announced not only that there would be no association agreement, but also there was no announcement of an effort to negotiate new terms, creating the impression for the whole country that Yanukovych had simply decided that his previous commitments, his previous assurances, were in no way binding upon him. He could change his mind for whatever reason he liked. And the country as a whole, which had been led expectantly to hope that the association agreement would be signed, the opinion of the nation was of no importance. The young demonstrators who were in the Maidan on the night of November 30th were there as the tail end of demonstrations that had taken place to support what was called Ukraine's European choice. And there were only a small number of them who were still there. And their intention was actually not to protest against anything, but to lend their support for what they thought would be the decision to associate with the European Union. In the end, they were savagely attacked by the police, by the riot police, and took refuge in the Mikhailovsky Cathedral, which the last time the cathedral offered refuge in a similar manner was when the Mongols attacked Kyiv and people fled to that monastery. The combination of the disappointment over the rejection of the European Union and the association agreement, rather, and the unprovoked beating of the young students is what set in motion the Maidan protests. But the background for it was years of insecurity that was felt by ordinary citizens in a situation in which the entire society was designed to enrich the very few, and in which there were really no protections for anyone. Anyone in Ukraine could imagine that he could be picked up, taken to a police station, beaten, and find himself without any recourse at all. And he could understand perfectly well that any business that he started could be taken away from him at a moment's notice. The depredations of Alexander Yanukovych, I'm talking now about Yanukovych's son, were such that many people started going around taking over businesses saying that they were from Alexander when in fact they didn't even know him and had no connection to him. The brand was sufficiently powerful that people, hearing that, no longer wanted to fight. Well, what is all this? What does all this mean for Russia? Because we really face a situation now in which Russia and Ukraine, countries that maybe were not at the absolute center of our attention in the U.S. For much of the previous 20 years, are now very, very important and actually a threat to world stability and European stability. The same type of regime exists in Russia. The takeover of property, the appropriation of people's enterprises, that began in earnest in Russia in 2003 after the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. When officials at all levels in Russia witnessed how easy it was to take over the biggest oil company, the biggest, most successful and most Western-oriented oil company in the country, using administrative means and abuse of the legal process, the experience was repeated at all levels of the government. It was repeated at the oblast level, it was repeated at the republic level, it was repeated at the rayon level. And so nothing that is good, that was done by Yanukovych was in any way strange or different or incompatible with what was being done in Russia. But at the same time, the Russian authorities understand perfectly well, and they understand it better than the Western observers who've been commenting on this question in many cases, that the example of Ukraine could be contagious. It's been said that 75%, and this is true, the poll results, the latest poll results said that in Russia showed that 75% of Russians don't believe that the Ukrainian experience can be repeated in Russia. But it's also important to bear in mind that the history of Russian opinion polls is such that, and of Russian public opinion is such, that that those numbers can change overnight and very dramatically. It doesn't pay to put too much stock in where people pronounce themselves at any given time, plus the fact they don't trust the pollsters. But what you had in Ukraine was, on the one hand, long-standing resentment over the lawlessness and the greed of the authorities. That exists in Russia. You had a specific situation which galvanized people, i.e. the refusal to sign the association agreement. In Russia, you had something similar with the falsification of the December 2011 parliamentary elections, which also brought 100,000 people out into the streets, although the demonstrations eventually fizzled. And finally, you had a spark. The spark was the beating of the students. Well, right now there's no spark in Russia, and there's no specific issue around which people can rally. But both of those can be supplied, and the nature of these lawless systems is such that they will be supplied. And the Russian authorities know it. That's why they've reacted to the Ukrainian situation in the way they have. One way in which the reaction has taken place is in the suppression of free speech. I can even mention my own case in this regard, because it was, as I look back on the events that led to my expulsion from Russia, it's important to bear in mind that the Russians had long bragged to Western correspondents that when they objected to their coverage, as they did on various times, that nobody has ever been expelled from Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. We don't do that anymore. So it was a point of pride that Russia was sufficiently self-confident that even the most odious correspondents and the most undesirable were nonetheless tolerated. And no one, I was not often mentioned by name, but a couple of people pointed out to me persons connected to the Russian authorities, that you see how liberal, they even give you visas. In any case, with the intensification of the situation in Ukraine, I think the cost-benefit analysis changed, and they decided that, in fact, I was more than they were prepared to tolerate. But it wasn't the only case. It wasn't the only case. There has been a crackdown on TV Rain, the internet television station, which is watched by the intelligentsia and liberal intelligentsia in Moscow, and the firing of the chief editor at Echo Moskvy, an event which is actually quite important and will have long-range implications. There were mass arrests when demonstrators protested the sentences in the Bolotny case. These were the persons who were arrested and charged for their participation in a demonstration after Putin was elected to his third term as president. And now, as we see the attempt to rally support for the regime by appealing to Russian chauvinism through the seizure of Crimea, the threats against Ukraine, and the predictable attempts that I believe we're going to see to create chaos in Ukraine in order to discredit the new government there and render and deliver an implicit warning to the Russian people that any such attempt to free themselves from the criminal oligarchy that runs the country will lead to nothing good. The referendum that is scheduled for Crimea on Sunday is almost certain to bring a vote in favor of joining Russia. That should not be taken seriously for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's important to bear in mind that the overwhelming support in Crimea was for the Party of the Regions. Previous to these events, Party of the Regions is Yanukovych's party. It's corrupt. It's an organized gang in the form of a political party. Nonetheless, its platform was for the unity of the country. Unity, the secession from Crimea was not an issue except among fringe groups in Crimea until this began. It's only under the impact of the situation, including the takeover of the parliament by unidentified troops, that it's being posed. And it's under these circumstances that people may, including ethnic Russians, may well vote to join Russia. I don't like the term Russian Federation, because the Russians like that term, and it's not a federation if you appoint all the governors. I never heard of such a federation, but they love to call themselves Russian Federation instead of something else, Russian dictatorship or something else. But equally important, the elections in Russia itself are falsified. There's a strong criminal element in Crimea. No reason to believe these elections are going to be any more honest than elections that take place in Russia. Can anything be done about this situation? Many people have argued, including some observers of Russia who are normally quite perceptive, that this is a done deal, that Russia has seized Ukraine, seized Crimea, that this is irreversible. And some have even argued that this is historic Russian territory. And although the borders of Ukraine have been recognized in numerous international undertakings by Russia. But I don't believe it's true. All of these regimes are extremely fragile. The Russian regime is much more fragile than people understand. Those who run it keep their assets in the West and their families in the West, their mistresses in the West. They've got and they have foreign passports. One of the characteristic consumer items for those who run the show in Russia is a private airplane. Those who sell private airplanes have a big business in Russia. And it's there, first of all, as a status item. Everyone likes to show that if their competitor can afford an airplane, so can they, and then they compete. They don't care about the technical technical characteristics or the safety, simply the prestige of the plane and the fact that they can use it to make a quick getaway if they need to, because they fear each other more than they fear the West. Half of the people in the Russian ruling group have in the back of their minds where they're going to go if things get hot for them, as they got for Yanukovych and his cohorts. So therefore, the West has enormous leverage. Money, the money that has poured into the West has almost without exception been laundered, and a huge amount of it from Russian sources is the result of criminal activity. Simply enforcing the money laundering laws, extending the Magnitsky list, and making it clear that the Russian authorities are going to have to live with their own lawlessness would be enough to bring tremendous pressure to bear on the Russian authorities, and to remind them that the whole world has an interest in the integrity of borders on the one hand, and in avoiding any kind of chaos in either Ukraine, which is a very important country and a very big one, and particularly in Russia, which has nuclear weapons. So therefore, in closing, I don't think the situation is hopeless. It's important to understand what is going on, that this is an effort on the part of Russia to protect the criminal oligarchic regime. And it's another example of the dangers of the status quo. Some may argue that we should just leave things as they are because the alternative is instability, and it could well be. They've tried to create those conditions. But the status quo is also dangerous, and we've had a vivid example of that. Anyway, I unfortunately have to leave, so I won't be able to go any further with this, but thank you very much for your attention.
We got one or two. You guys just take maybe I'll take.
All right. If there are questions, maybe I can take one or two before I have to. I'm going to Ohio, and I have to get there. But if anyone has any questions in response to what I've said, I'll try to answer them briefly. Yes, please.
Terry Campo, just an attorney here in town that worked in Russia. David, I wonder if you would agree with the characterization that part of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is they've created the version of capitalism that the communists taught capitalism was.
That was absolutely true, and that's not an accident, because they grew up they were raised on novels which showed the depravity of capitalism, and then overnight they were told that capitalism, which their whole lives they'd been told was bad, was actually good. That meant that criminality was also good, and it was drummed into the head of every kid who grew up, every person who grew up in the Soviet Union, that the first stage of capitalism is the criminal accumulation of wealth. Now, since capitalism is now, then they were told that capitalism is the way for the future. So it followed that they had a moral obligation to steal and kill, and then they fulfilled that obligation. Anybody else? Well, you're in. Hi.
Hi. Reuters just reported that Kiptash, one of the richest men in Ukraine, and the man who actually made Lifting Yanukovych, has been arrested in Vienna. Do you think this is the beginning of something?
What? I didn't realize Firtash was arrested. It was I thought it was really Akhmetov who was Yanukovych's first. But I mean, they were all young. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. Well, Lazarenko was arrested, former prime minister and in Ukraine and boss of Yulia Tymoshenko.
But it's not confirmed.
What?
The arrest is not confirmed.
Oh, it's not confirmed. Well, of course. Then in that case, who knows? Who knows what it means? But I'm sure there's plenty to arrest him for. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed. And now I'd like to introduce Ambassador George Chapari, who is the Hungarian ambassador to the United States, who will in turn introduce our keynote speaker, Paula Dobriansky, this morning. As I mentioned before, this conference owes its genesis in a conversation between myself and the ambassador, in which we both felt that what was happening in Central Europe was extremely important to the United States and to Western Europe, but that it wasn't receiving the attention that it deserved and that it needed. Now, as I mentioned also, the Ukraine evolution of the crisis has developed very dramatically differently. But it's my great pleasure to introduce the ambassador, because he is someone who brings to his position here in Washington an enormous amount of experience in international affairs. He left Hungary in 1956. He became a successful economist, and he served in several in senior positions in several international institutions of an economic kind. He returned to Hungary after the development of freedom there after 1989, and he's since played a role in he's since played an important role in public life, culminating in his present position. I won't say more now because he himself will have some remarks, but let me introduce Ambassador George Chapari, welcome him to the occasion, and ask him to introduce Paula, who perhaps, Paula, you would like to join us on the podium. And I think Ken and I are going to take our part in the waves.
So, good morning, everybody. When John and I discussed in Budapest what should be the topic of this conference, and we said it should be, of course, Central and Eastern Europe, because Hungary has the chairmanship of the V4, Visegrad 4 countries, and we will sort of discuss whether it should be talking about the crisis of economic crisis or the role of V4 in the world, etc. And then suddenly a topic came that gave itself, which is Ukraine. So that's how we are now today talking about Ukraine. Just let me say a few words about the Visegrad 4 countries' role in this crisis. We have had a very active role. We had several visits. The V4 ministers of foreign affairs went to Ukraine. The V4 prime ministers issued statements. More recently, the V4 ambassadors here in Washington wrote a letter to Boehner and Reid to encourage LNG gas exports to Europe because that would reduce the dependence of these countries on Russian gas, and it would weaken Russian use of gas as a political tool. Now, before I introduce Paula, let me leave on the table a couple of thoughts. As it was mentioned, I left Hungary in 1956. I was a high school student, and parallel strikes me. At that time, the Russians said, or the Soviets said exactly the same thing they said now on the people of Maidan, that the people on the streets are fascists. And then they had to be invited. They were invited by somebody. This is why they came in to clear the streets from the fascists and to defend the people. So you know this parallel is really striking. And the other thought that I wanted to leave on the table is something that I would like to regard that Kurt Walker wrote quite recently in the Time magazine, and he said that, so what is the key lesson here? And he goes on, Ukraine and the loss of Crimea is merely an example of a larger issue. What happens when we fail to protect and promote freedom in the world? Each individual step may seem bearable, but in the long run, these creeping assaults on freedom are deeply damaging to US interests. And I would add to the word interest. Because if the US leaves a vacuum, or gives the perception that there is a vacuum, then another big country that has the ambition to become a world power moves in. And that's what happened right now. And this is a lesson for the United States and also for the Euro, that you know, you have the responsibility to defend the freedom of the world, because if not, somebody else would come in and fill this vacuum. Now let me introduce Paula. Such a long and distinguished career, so I would just pick the ones that I think the most important ones. And I would start immediately with saying that Paula finished, went to the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and afterwards went to Harvard University. I mention this because the alma mater is the most important thing in one's life, isn't it? And and so that's the, I think, the one that I wanted to say at the beginning. And right now, Paula is a senior fellow at Harvard University's JFK Byford Center for Science and International Affairs. And Paula had a very distinguished career in the administration. From 2001 to 2009, she served as the Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, the longest serving in history in that position. Was also, in 2007, President Special Envoy to Northern Ireland, and for her work there, got the Distinguished Service Medal, which is very important. And, and I have also known Paula as a very great friend of Hungary, among other countries, and you also received the Hungarian Commander of Cross Order of Merit, and, very important, also the Ukraine's Order of Merit. So, Paula, the word is yours. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone, and first, thank you, Ambassador, very, very much for those very kind remarks and introduction. And I do want to thank Ken and also John for bringing us together. And it is true, by the way, when you first contacted me, it was a different topic, by the way. And so here we are. But you know, I will say, even despite that fact, nevertheless, I think that what many of us would have said, there are certain points that would have been said then and also now, given the situation on the ground. Because I start with the fact that when you look at the crisis in Ukraine and its impact on the Transatlantic Alliance, and also looking at those countries in Central Europe and the neighborhood, you know, we're bound. We're bound by moral values. We are bound by freedom. We are bound also by a mission that, by the way, has been a bipartisan mission of US administrations, and that is to obtain a Europe whole and free. And so in that sense, I think that we would have heard those messages. But let me, in my remarks, I'd like to cover a number of points. Some that are broader and putting this issue in context and how it in turn impacts the alliance and also certainly Central Europe, but also looking at the developments in Ukraine itself. The current crisis in Ukraine definitely has ramifications, not just only for the neighborhood, meaning certainly for Central Europe, for Europe as a whole, and of course for Ukraine itself. But you know, this crisis has global ramifications, which we need to step back and take stock of. How the West handles, in fact, Russia's aggression will matter, and also will impact our long-standing goal of striving for a Europe whole and free. What happens and how this crisis gets handled does have direct ramifications for certainly other global situations that are also afoot. Russia's current military actions in Crimea, if coupled with an anemic Western response, will also deal a great blow to freedom, to international law, to so many aspects of our alliance that bind us together. Crucial is also at this time the fact that the United States and Europe have to also be thinking about a strategy. Central Europe is a key component of that strategy for addressing the concerns of the neighborhood and of what's happening in Ukraine. And by the way, in this regard, you know, we remind ourselves, what binds the alliance? You'll be having panels that will be focusing on this, but the Transatlantic Alliance that is bound together, we're bound by security, by a commitment to also prosperity and the welfare of our citizens that's grounded in freedom. And coupled, of course, with that steady spread of freedom and liberty to all. We all have a vital interest in not seeing that foundation reversed in any capacity. So here, also in an alliance context, you know, there's also the element of what are the components of security. There's, of course, the recommitment to NATO. When you look at Central Europe and the countries as part of Central Europe, they are part of NATO. I hear now many of the countries calling and reminding about Article 5 in the event that it's necessary to be reminded about Article 5 and its rededication to all members. Also, there's been the appeal for exercises in the neighborhood. I mention this because this was an initiative that's come particularly from Central Europe about the show of force on the ground and in the neighborhood. And then also there's the issue of constant communication. Absolutely essential here because it's not only in the context of our alliance, but it's also political communication. As the ambassador said, certainly the Visegrad Four have always had a very firm voice, a voice about what happens in the neighborhood and about its future. Let me step back and, if you don't mind, put the current situation in Ukraine in context. In other words, I want to put forth a few general points that I think are important to keep in mind. The first is that the whole issue about Ukraine. We read a lot about what Ukraine is. And Ukraine has always been ethnically diverse. Does that mean that it is divided and a split is imminent? Well, I would remind you that when Ukraine obtained its independence, by the way, there was a referendum. And if you look at the referendum and the results of that referendum, actually all parts of Ukraine, including the eastern part, were completely in support of the independence of Ukraine as a holistic entity and country. There was no diversion from that. Secondly, I'm straining to think about any kind of examples of secessionist movements that have taken place in Ukraine. I don't know of any in this regard, meaning in terms of, and I will move Crimea, as David mentioned, has talked about its independence. But by the way, Crimea has talked about its independence always in the context of being affiliated with and part of Ukraine. So going back to the referendum, let me make the point that here, I remember when Ukraine got its independence, there was the referendum. There was also an assessment that was done, a governmental assessment by the National Intelligence Council at the time. That I remember there was a big article in the New York Times that talked about Ukraine and that there were prospects for, you know, a potential split. You know, Ukraine got its independence, and up to this time, it has been united. It has worked out issues from within. I'm removing aside the state of Ukraine at the moment, only speaking about the ethnic component of Ukraine. I think it's important, though, to remind ourselves and to look at what has happened over these years, because I think what we are witnessing now, just about every leader has talked about the trumped-up charges. Secretary Kerry the other day was talking about the trumped-up concerns that have been registered as to why you have military on the ground and forcing a referendum in Crimea. Russia's aggression in Ukraine also quite significantly constitutes a breach of international law. You know many of the different documents that have been cited. One that I'd like to mention, and then another, OSCE. Why OSCE? Because one of the solutions that has been put forth for the crisis in Crimea was bring in monitors. Have the monitors come in to look at the allegations about the concerns of those Russians, the ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Crimea. You know they've been blocked at the border. They haven't been able to get in, despite international pressure, and also countries of Central Europe also embracing this very reasonable approach. But I want to flag another issue that hasn't been well addressed, and actually I co-authored an op-ed on, and that is the Budapest Memorandum. And why the Budapest Memorandum? You may recall that when Ukraine got its independence, by the way, it was a significant nuclear power, and Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. The Budapest Memorandum was among the US, the UK, and Russia. And if you look at the terms of the memorandum, all three signed it. It calls for, in return for giving up those nuclear weapons, the guarantee of territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine. Well, we are witnessing a violation directly of that particular memorandum. And what are the ramifications? Think about it. I mentioned about the global ramifications of this crisis. It does matter about the neighborhood, but it also goes beyond. Why? Because there are countries like Iran that are looking at nuclear issues. Then you have, in another part of the world, Japan, also looking at issues playing out in the Pacific. This literally undercuts the spirit, not only of the specifics of that memorandum, but also of the whole issue of nuclear non-proliferation. A grave concern. Let me also share with you a quote that was just in the Washington Post the other day in an op-ed, if you read it, by Senator Menendez. I thought it was an interesting quote. It said, only a few months ago this was said, quote, "We must stop using the language of force and return to the path of civilized diplomatic and political settlement." You know who said that? President Putin. It was in his letter that was published in the New York Times about Syria. And it's worth reminding ourselves of what was said in the context of Syria is not applicable and being addressed and having the same consistency of approach in this particular case. And also just one other broad point I want to put forth. David talked about polls. And you know, you look at polls and you wonder, well, what do they mean and what's the impact? But I can't help myself in at least mentioning one that has gone around. And this is according to the state-owned All Russia Center for the Study of Public Relations. 73% of Russians when they were polled, they said that they were against intervention in Ukraine. I thought that that poll was worth citing in the mix of polls. So when you look at this context, let me mention two other points regarding the developments of what's happened on the ground. When you look back at last year, when then President Yanukovych had indicated that he was not going to sign the accession agreement with the EU, we know that protests broke out. They broke out because of the desire to move forward with that agreement. I think it's important to underscore the reason why was because if Ukraine moved forward with that agreement, Ukraine would have to undertake a series of austerity measures, which in turn would bring about significant economic and political reforms. This was crucial for the country. People demonstrated in the streets because they wanted to see these reforms take foot. And the second point, which you also heard by David this morning, the other main factor that brought young people and others out in the street was corruption. The desire to see significant change take place in Ukraine and really to take the necessary steps in order to correct it. Fast forward to February, we know that the Polish foreign minister, along with the French and the German, had sat down with then President Yanukovych to try to work out an arrangement between the protesters and with Yanukovych's government going forward. I don't know if all of you took a look at that document. That document called for elections for this year, by the end of this year, free and fair elections. It called for also holding accountable all of those complicit in the deaths, the some 100 deaths that occurred in the protests. It also called for economic reforms, specific economic reforms. I'm mentioning this because, as you may recall, actually coming out of that, the ministers announced that the document had been signed. And it was signed by them and also by then President Yanukovych. Well, two things happened after that. One, it's worth noting that also in this mix, by the way, Russian Ambassador Lukin was also on site. He did not support or sign this document, but he was present there during these discussions. And then secondly, Yanukovych, as you may recall, he signed this document, and then do you recall there were a couple of days where no one could find him. He disappeared, and then he ended up in Moscow. I mention this because these developments occurred before, by the way, the government, interim government, took hold in Ukraine. It basically had an agreement, but then President Yanukovych fled. He fled on his own accord. In this context, what is the agenda forward for Ukraine? Ukraine basically has an agenda that in many ways builds upon those points. Holding elections on May 25, the government now is interim. And by the way, this interim government has set up an anti-corruption bureau. And some of you may or may not know the person who heads that bureau is the journalist who was beaten up. In fact, when she was reporting, in fact, on President Yanukovych's mansion, she was brutally beaten. She was in many newspapers in the West. She is the interim head of that corruption bureau. But the holding of elections, undertaking and a commitment for reforms, economic reforms, this is the kind of mandate that has been put forward. Let me mention two other elements that I think matter here. Why does Ukraine matter? This is a question that I at least have read and seen come forward in different commentaries. Why does it matter to the United States and to Europe, no less to Central Europe? It matters, first of all, it is a country of 46 million. It is a country the size of France. It's a country that's at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. And we know that if Ukraine's economy tanks, and we know that it is in dire straits in terms of its economy, that will have major reverberations. certainly for the neighborhood, Central Europe, the bordering countries, but it will have a spillover effect even beyond Central Europe in terms of Europe as a whole. Having a stable, a secure, a country like Ukraine able to make its own choices and to be economically viable and to choose its own economic path is in everyone's interest. And let me also just mention another important data point, and that is the whole question here about the scale and the scope of Russian actions. We have witnessed what has taken place in Crimea. The other day, the foreign minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, tweeted that he noticed that there were movements on Russian troop movements on the border of Ukraine again. And the question here is really, you know, what does this portend? And in that regard, Central Europe does have a very vital role. It is on that border and that neighborhood. And it is incumbent upon those countries, certainly, to reach out in the context of NATO, to reach out in the context of the EU, and to make its views known. Also, by the way, it's worth noting, in Ukraine, 17% approximately are ethnic Russian. Did you know that in Latvia the figure is 27%, and in Estonia it's 26%? It's worth taking a note that the number of ethnic Russians in Ukraine are actually, in terms of the percentage, lower than in Latvia and Estonia. I have a few final points to make, and that is, how do we go from here? Let me address the broad and then the specific. First is, it's absolutely essential that the West be unified in its response. The response must be strong, it has to be resolute. Russia must know that its actions are not going to be tolerated. That Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is in fact sacrosanct, as Secretary Rice said the other day in her op-ed piece. It's not negotiable. But there is a broader challenge also impacting the future of Europe and the future of Ukraine. And I mentioned that at the beginning, and I'll mention it again. And that is the fact that it should be able to and free to make its own choices, which is part of the mandate of a Europe whole and free. If we don't have a strong response, our own actions are going to be not only having an impact in this region, but it will also be taken note of by dictators, by tyrants, by extremists in other parts of the world. They'll be emboldened by a weak response. And the very essence of our values will, in fact, be discredited and called into question. What are the specifics that could be done? Well, here I would pick out just two that I think, and there are many, and you've heard a number from David this morning, but I pick out two. The first is the freezing of the assets. I pick that out because, you know, really to go to the heart of what a lot of this is about in terms of crime, corruption, that I think will have a great deal of impact where it should. In fact, Anders Oslund, some of you may know his name, he wrote, in fact, that just in the last days, when there were troops that were amassed on the border, and then after, remember, President Putin gave his press conference, did you know that the stock market index, the Russian trading system stock market index, plummeted by 12% in particular, and the prices of the stocks of large state-owned companies plunged? He said, quote, the Gazprom stocks fell by 15% and the state bank VTB by 20%. The ruble fell by 1.9% in relation to the US dollar. I just cite this. Anders is an economist. I'm not an economist. But just in that small span of time, there was a consequence and an impact. Secondly, you'll be having a full panel on energy I think that's an important area to be looking at. And there again, going back to the importance of the alliance and Central Europe, they have a direct role in this because they're impacted by it. In the case of Ukraine, 70% of Ukraine's energy supplies and natural gas is gotten from Russia. Europe is also very much well affected, as you all know. This is an area that the United States can readily address, and as we've witnessed in recent days, many Europeans have been focusing on this particular option much more closely than had been the case. So in conclusion, I think that this is a very grave time. I think it is a time of peril, and it's a time in which the West must stand up, and it must have strong, decisive actions. Otherwise, as I mentioned, we will send not only the wrong message for the neighborhood and have the consequences that we will have to bear if we do not take such united, strong action in this crisis situation. Thank you very much, and let me end there. Thank you.
Please sit down, because before I will be asking the audience with one or two questions, but let me, before that, come back to a couple of points you raised. You mentioned, you referred to the Budapest Agreement, where they have, Russia has also guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and also the quote from Putin's New York op-ed, where it said everything has to be resolved by discussions around the table. And here comes what I had said earlier, that precisely because of this, they always need somebody who calls them in to come to send in the troops, because that's showing that, you know, we are in paper for the agreement, but there is somebody who has called us in to march in to defend the people. So it's two things go together in their mind. And who was the person who called them in? This time it was Yanukovych, you know, wrote a letter. So, you know, the tactic here. The other thing is you raised the question on the languages. This is very important because the borders in the whole of Europe, and mostly in Central and Eastern Europe, became the results of kingdoms lost and won wars, etc. And the borders were not drawn according to languages. It came out of a different process. So you have languages in minority languages in the various countries. So this is a very bad example. If you say that, you know, you can come in to defend that particular ethnic group. And as you mentioned, Latvia and Estonia, they are particularly nervous about it because they have a very large Russian minority. And the last point I wanted to make, and this is also a question, that how about the economic sanction? The economic interest of the West, US and also some Western countries, is Russia is so intertwined that you know, any sanction that will come will hurt these the certain companies, and so I will not be surprised that we will end up with very little economic sanctions. But this is one question I had. What do you think? How effective these sanctions will be?
Oh, I chose freezing assets and I chose energy, knowing that this question of economic sanctions, it's been an issue that's already been raised. Many in Europe have cited the fact that the volume of their trade with Russia is much greater than that of the United States. But having said that, personally, I am a proponent not just only of freezing assets, but I am of economic sanctions. I think that you have to look at your actions, and you can't just divorce trade relationships and hold them completely in isolation to other developments going on. you heard a very compelling presentation by David Sather, and a very core point of his presentation was about the kind of corruption and crime that underpins Ukraine and Russia today. So the question is, by the way, for the good of business, you have to step back and ask, do you want to actually have vibrant business opportunities based on transparency, openness, or are you going to have trade relationships and foreign direct investment that is compromised in certain ways? Now, you could say that's very easy for me to say because, every country has its own set of issues that they have to worry about in terms of their own population. But I have no doubt that when countries take a look at what opportunities exist, like in the energy realm, for example, there are alternatives for business. And I think that's what the answer is here. I think that the West really needs to sit down and to look at what are these economic alternatives. What are the kinds of alternate paths that can be seized here, and where basically you still have populations and countries that are able to benefit from relationships. But at the same time, I think it's also worth taking a look at what also exists at this time and that really needs to be revisited.
Thank you. Let's have 1 or 2 questions. Yes?
Me?
The lady, yes.
I was going to say, I think we're getting a signal, so I think we're getting 1 question and
Thank you.
we're going to move to the panel.
I have a bit of scary question. My name is Natalia Lakiza. I'm from US Ukraine Foundation. I'm a lead expert on Ukraine, and I follow events in Ukraine almost 24/7. So my question is from a bit different sphere, military sphere. You have now, you're right, the situation in Ukraine changes every day, and now we have more than 80,000 Russian troops along the eastern border of Ukraine. We have 30,000 in Crimea. Ukraine started 2 military trainings in the west and in the east, NATO trainings in Black Sea. I value your opinion as an expert on Ukraine and continued supporter of Ukraine at different levels in the government. So is it just a demonstration of muscles, or is it a real preparation to local, regional, or, God forbid, world war?
Well, there's a precedent here, and I think you're going to hear about it on the panel, who's coming right up, so as I answer this question. Georgia. When you look at Georgia, when troops came in and Russian troops came in and took Abkhazia and South Ossetia, there's a question as to whether they would have gone further. This goes to my point about the need for a strong Western response. And I think the belief was that there was a strong response that stemmed potentially the tide of troops going further. I think everyone is on alert, hence my mentioning Foreign Minister Carl Bildt. And I think, just simply put, I think that what we need to be concerned about right now is, and I'll repeat it the last time, having a strong, resolute, united response from the West that is grounded in economic, financial, and military options here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you very much. And Joan has asked me that we will have a 5-minute coffee break now. Thank you.
Brother's testosterone. How old's okay, so about 2 days.
All right, this panel addresses Russia, Europe, and the United States, and it focuses on the key implications of the crisis for international security and stability. These are obviously, the decisions these actors take will have a major impact. How Europe and the U.S. respond or fail to respond will, of course, matter, as will the question posed to Russia. What are Russia's aims and what are their capabilities? For Europe and the U.S., the key kind of issues we need to be concerned about is how do we best influence Russia's decisions? How do we reassure one another? And also, how do we reassure some of Russia's vulnerable neighbors, which we'll hear more about later today, in terms of their security and their interests as the crisis evolves. It's interesting that some of these countries, such as Kazakhstan, has actually been asked by President Obama to make an effort to try and resolve the crisis, whereas others, such as Georgia, must be pondering the implications for their own security in occupied territories. And we've been here before. Ken mentioned the Czech crisis in '68. More recently, there's been Russian involvement during the 1990s in manipulating some of the conflicts, detaching part of Moldova, encouraging the occupation of Nagorno-Karabakh and some surrounding Azerbaijani regions, and then the events in Georgia with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And these territories still are detached. And so we need to consider going forward how best to manage this crisis so that we can perhaps do better than we've done in the past. With that, I'm very pleased to introduce the three of the speakers. I'll introduce them as they speak. The first speaker is Andrew Hutchins. He is the Senior Fellow and Director of the CSAS program on Russia and Europe. An internationally known expert on Russian foreign and domestic policies, does many interviews and commentary for business, government, media, and academia. Before running the CSAS program from 2000 to 2006, he was at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, running its program in Washington on Russian and Eurasian affairs, and also director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, where I've had the opportunity to speak on times, and it's been a nice free island in the midst of sometimes an impressive think tank community. So I think we all benefit from the contributions he's made at Carnegie as well as CSAS. Thank you, Andy. Please go ahead. And you're welcome to speak up here or from the seat, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Oh, thank you, Richard. That kind invitation. I'll stay seated. If I stand up, that might only further enervate me more than I already am. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak here this morning. Delighted to be here with you and Julie and Richard, especially Julie, we're colleagues together at the CSIS for a number of years. I was planning on having to start apologizing for being late, and I've been late a lot recently. I missed a train from New York yesterday. I missed a train to New York the day before. Had to miss my class last week being late, and I basically blame it on Mr. Putin. The dude is just messing with my whole life. And I'm not really happy about it. And as my friends from the South say, we're going to have a little talking to about this, and it's not going to be very diplomatic. But seriously, I want to share with you to start out with an email that I wrote very late Monday night. It was actually early Tuesday morning, because I actually wrote it to my boss, John Hamry at CSIS. It kind of captures where I was with this crisis. I'll just read you this, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about what I think is going on with our dear friend Vladimir and how he's thinking about this and what he might do. I'll be very frank with you. Well, I usually don't pull any punches anyway. But I'm very, very worried, deeply concerned. To me, I feel like we're in the most dangerous place right now for European security, probably since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and maybe even a little bit before that. So this is what I wrote. My brain and my bones tell me that the Ukraine-Crimea-Russia standoff is going to end very, very badly. The best case scenario seems now just for Ukraine and Russia to avoid war. While there was plenty of blame for the EU, Russia, and Ukraine leading up to Yanukovych's about-face in November, with his Crimea escapade, Putin went off the reservation, so to speak, and to mix metaphors, for the past 10 days seems to be doubling down on disaster at every instance. With the imminent referendum on Crimea on the 16th, a point at which walking anything back, or to use Obama's terminology of Putin using an off-ramp, is impossible. At some point, one, the 5 theses, I guess, At some point, it seems inevitable that there will be violence in Crimea. There are simply too many people living on that peninsula who object to unification with Russia. 2, the Ukrainian government cannot take such a result lying down. They are virtually on a war footing now. How they have been able to restrain themselves to the point has required more than the patience of Job. Putin, I believe, is under the false impression that eastern and southern areas of Ukraine really do want to join Russia. I think he may believe his own propaganda, and the Russian media is doing everything it can to whip up a war frenzy. The Russian narrative on Ukraine has lost touch with reality and/or created an alternative reality that bears little resemblance to facts on the ground. 4, Moscow's narrative is completely at odds with that of Europe and our own. Real diplomacy is virtually impossible when perspectives are at such odds with each other. Whatever happens, as long as Putin is around, our approach to Russia, and I mean the United States and Europe, will never be the same. There is nothing that has happened in the past 3 days for me to alter that perspective, unfortunately. I wish Mr. Kerry all the luck in the world in talking with his counterpart, Mr. Lavrov, tomorrow, but I think I'm not optimistic. I'm not optimistic about it. The most worrisome thing for me about this is that it has led me to question some fundamental assumptions I have had, kind of my operational code, so to speak, to go back to old Sovietological terminology that I cut my teeth on. The operational code of Vladimir Putin. And I've always looked at Putin as essentially a cold, brutally cold, calculating, realist, pragmatist, whatever you want to call it. And he carefully assesses the cost benefit of his moves. In this move, starting with the military occupation of Crimea, I think he's made a serious miscalculation. I would love to be wrong. At this point, the best case scenario, I think, is essentially a referendum goes through on Sunday. I don't think there's a big mystery about how that referendum will go. As Stalin used to say, it's not who votes, but who counts the votes. And there will be a vote for unification with Russia. If there is no violence, then that is very good. If Russia will then have on its hands, it would seem, not such a digestible tidbit, so to speak, in Crimea. There are lots of actually quite pragmatic, on-the-ground challenges they would face, like the fact that how do you get drinking water to Crimea? It's virtually entirely dependent upon Ukraine for that, the rest of Ukraine for that. Excuse me. Don't misunderstand me or try to, I don't want to go get deep into semantics. Energy, electricity, etc. You know, at some point, even in this scenario, the Russians and/or the Crimean government, quote unquote, is going to have to negotiate. You can't have an airlift for drinking water for 2 million people. But more importantly, and of course, this best case scenario involves that there is no further Russian military engagement, intervention elsewhere in Ukraine, because that is the disaster scenario. That does mean war, in my view. All right. So what was Mr. Putin thinking when he did this? Clearly there was a plan on the shelf for this, stealthy kind of intervention into Crimea, which was tactically quite clever and effective. But I think it gets to the fundamental question is, what does Mr. Putin want, frankly, in Ukraine? Well, he wants certainly a government in Kyiv which is not overtly anti-Russian. He certainly doesn't want a government which would renege on the long-term agreement for the stationing of the Black Sea Fleet in Sebastopol. He would want, I think, a different federal structure for Ukraine, which would provide considerably more autonomy. He would, for not just Crimea, but for eastern and southern portions of Ukraine. And he would not want what happens in Ukraine, I think, to obstruct his ambitions for his post-Soviet reintegration project. And he probably wouldn't want to have what happens in Ukraine to have a very significant and dramatic impact on the Russian economy. The Russian economy is already in a vulnerable position, experiencing a growth rate of between 0 and 1%, despite the fact that the oil price remains still over $100 a barrel. He's done quite a remarkable thing, or a remarkable thing has happened since he's become, or since de facto and de jure power have reunited, shall we say, in Russia in 2012. There's been a very strong correlation between the oil price and growth, or lack of growth, in the Russian economy, going back to the first oil crisis in 1973. More than 40 years, that correlation has actually been broken. I mean, we have a deeply stagnated Russian economy and with a high oil price environment. Leave that aside. With where we are with the military occupation of Crimea and the imminent referendum coming up on Sunday, what does the score sheet look like, most likely, for what I think are Mr. Putin's goals? See, because the great irony, as I'm where I'm going to conclude, is I think that probably Mr. Putin would have achieved those goals without a military occupation. I think what has happened already has gone a long way to promote national identity throughout Ukraine. Mr. Putin may be regarded historically as the godfather of Ukrainian national integration. That's a ways down the road, obviously. But I mean, have not seen, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the East and the South that were clamoring for joining the Russian Federation, or are doing so more so now. Clearly, they're watching things very, very carefully and trying to figure out the best course of action. But, I mean, no Ukrainian government at this point is going to be able to regard Russia in the same way that it did before Mr. Yanukovych fled and before the military occupation of Crimea. 2, on the post-Soviet integration project. First of all, we all know that everybody for lack of a better term, in the post-Soviet space is extremely nervous, would be a euphemism, I think, to describe their views on things right now. Many of the states are in very, very awkward positions, and let me just Suffice to say, I think that what he has done is going to not facilitate a more rapid reintegration of post-Soviet space. I'll leave it at that. We can have questions and discussion about it after, because I see the clock is ticking. Finally, the economy. Well, let me just say that this was a decision that was taken that in disregard for the economic ramifications therefrom. Already, when I wrote that email on Monday, the ruble was trading at an all-time low, at more than 36 to the dollar. That was more than 10% lower than what it was at the nadir of a global financial crisis in January of 2009. And certainly some bad things expected in the future has been factored into that, but it seems that we're on a path of sort of inevitable spiraling, further spiraling of the relation, downward spiraling of the relationship between the United States and Russia and Europe and Russia, but I won't say any more about that. So what does Mr. Putin want? I've been re-examining that question. Again, I kind of go to the cost-benefit analysis, but let's remember what Mr. Putin told Mr. Bush in Bucharest in April of 2008, essentially that Ukraine is not a real country. Not a real country. I think that if Mr. Putin had greater capacity, he would pursue this reintegration much more assertively and aggressively than he even has. But I think he's been fairly astute in measuring how much capacity he has. My fear here, though, is that he may have lost a bit of his sense of the balance in this. So let me just stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, for your insightful comments. Our next speaker is Julian Smith. She is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Strategy and Statecraft Program at the Center for New American Security right across the street. She's also a Senior Vice President at Global Strategies LLC. Her most recent position in government was a very prominent one. She was Deputy National Security Advisor to the U.S. Vice President from April 2012 to June 2013. Before that, she served as Principal Director for European and NATO policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon, which included NATO and European policy. And that involved her dealing with 31 different countries, and she was also awarded the Office of the Secretary of Defense Medal for exceptional public service. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Smith, and looking forward to your comments.
Thanks Richard for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a chilly morning to have a discussion on the crisis in Ukraine. I just want to take a few minutes and talk about the transatlantic angle, transatlantic cooperation specifically, and kind of how this has unfolded over the last couple of weeks. And I wanted to issue a bit of a report card on a couple of different fronts. One, I wanted to say something about what transatlantic cooperation looked like before the crisis hit in this corner of the world. And then more importantly, I wanted to take a look at how Europe and the United States have tried to do three things. One, push back on Russian aggression and get the Russians out of Crimea. Two, what kind of job they're doing in working with the new Ukrainian government. And three, how they're faring in reassuring our partners and allies in Central and Eastern Europe who, as Andy noted, are very concerned and quite skittish about what they've been watching in their neighborhood and worried about the implications for their own security. So just up front, before the crisis hit, I think Europe and the United States deserve pretty low marks, close to a fail, on how they've been managing this corner of the world. I think they've been fairly confident in their ability to sit back and let events unfold in front of them. They haven't been particularly active. The EU obviously has been more active than the United States. But in many ways, I think the approach of both Europe and the United States was to look at this corner of the world and say, all right, there are some rough spots, there are some difficult transitions, but by and large, the major work that we put forward together in those first few years after the end of the Cold War is now coming to a close, and we are consumed with events in the Middle East, we're consumed with issues like Syria and Egypt and Yemen and Iraq and Afghanistan, and the list goes on, and therefore we won't be able to dedicate as much time and as many resources to this corner of the world. And the end result of that lack of focus is now unfolding right before our eyes in terms of a fairly sloppy response both by the Europeans and the Americans in trying to grapple with this. So that brings me to my first grading area, and that is the first mark I want to issue, and that is how have Europe and the United States done in pushing back on Russian aggression. So in the first few hours and days after we saw the Russians go into Crimea, I thought the response looked particularly sloppy. I would give it a D, if not failing. Europe and the United States were not lashed up at all. We saw the White House come out immediately on that Friday and lean into the president's speech about costs. We saw Europe stand back and then call an emergency session of the EU that would then be held 3 days later on a Monday. Apparently they were unable to hold an emergency session on a crisis of this scale on a weekend, which is a little bit surprising. And I talked to a lot of folks in the White House, and folks were obviously scrambling to get European counterparts on the line. But what you saw immediately was kind of the worst case scenario, and that was a very public transatlantic debate about the differences that we had in how we were going to approach the crisis. So immediately you had countries like Germany and the UK and the Netherlands come out and say, hey, we just want to state up front, sanctions might be a bridge too far, we have some hesitation on that, we really want to go for engagement and dialogue, and Merkel was proposing at that time the contact group. And the United States was leaning in pretty heavily to the sanctions idea. And so the worst case scenario is to have this debate publicly, because as we all know, Putin always likes to seize on any opportunity to drive a wedge between the transatlantic partners. And so those first few days felt deeply uncomfortable. It looked like there was no communication going on, that we didn't have a plan, that Europe and the United States were in fact going to be on opposite pages on this. And then over time, I think the marks, I would grade them slightly higher, were more lashed up. We've tucked some of the debates behind closed doors, private discussions. Last week, Dan Fried flew over and had a very good session with European counterparts on sketching out exactly what targeted sanctions could look like, starting to list the individuals that they would go after. They started looking at visa bans, they looked at asset freezes, they started sharing information. This should have happened sooner, but at least we're getting our act together a little bit on the economic front to try and coordinate what we want to do together. We also saw finally Europe and the United States come together in calling off the G8 preparatory meetings. This isn't a big stick, obviously. Putin may brush this off, but long term, what I'd like to see it lead to is a complete elimination of the G8 in practice as a forum, which I think would send a pretty strong signal. And I'd very much like to see a G7 meeting put on the calendar in the next couple of months. I know that would be challenging to do within this calendar year, but I think it would be an important symbol. Then we had Europe and the United States take a couple of unilateral steps. We've had the US call off all mill-to-mill engagement with the Russians, which was important. There's very little that Putin cares about. He cares about the economy and the trade relationship to a certain extent. And he does care, at least his military advisors seem to indicate that they do care about the mill-to-mill engagement with the United States, and so we shut the door on that. We're looking now also at OECD membership. That's something the Russians have been pretty aggressively pursuing, and so we've turned the spigot off on that front. So at this point, there's more to be done, but in terms of how I would grade coordination, we're getting better. It was sloppy, like I said, and difficult up front, but at least now the channels of communication are open. We now appear to be a little bit more on the same page. The Germans in particular have been able to lean into their relationship. Merkel's relationship with Putin has been very important, and she's been very helpful in relaying messages back. to the White House and serving as a bit of an interlocutor, and is a little bit less off the ranch in terms of where she wants to go with sanctions. Second category, supporting the new Ukrainian government. I think we've done a slightly better job from a transatlantic perspective. We had the Kerry visit followed immediately by the Lady Ashton visit. Those visits, obviously largely symbolic but important, and then followed up by pledges of $15 billion in assistance by the European Union, $1 billion in assistance by the United States. There are complications in delivering on those pledges, and of course the Ukrainians need far more than that. They're estimating they need somewhere in the mid-30s, possibly $35, $37 million of assistance, billion, sorry. But anyways, the wheels are turning, and I feel like we've tried to make some progress there. We are both sending technical advisors. We're going to turn the lights on a Ukrainian Business Council meeting. Carlos Pascual will be flying over to have a conversation about energy. There are all sorts of things that they're trying to do at the State Department to enhance the government-to-government contacts. Of course, having the PM here yesterday was important as well. So on that front, I think it'll be constant, and the challenge for the transatlantic partners will be not to make the mistake they made last time, and that is to lose sight of what the long-term goals are for Ukraine and not support it in the medium and long term. It can't just be in the next couple of weeks and months. This is a long-term endeavor. We're going to need a grand strategy and kind of a joint approach on supporting this new team, and there are plenty of challenges. Lastly, on the reassurance piece, the United States, I would give slightly higher marks than the Europeans, the U.S., in some ways Central and Eastern Europe's looking for more reassurance from their U.S. partners. We've seen the U.S. commit additional F-15s to the Baltic air policing mission, and the U.S. is also enhancing training in Poland. I think from my conversations with folks over at the Pentagon, they're looking at an array of other reassurance initiatives that could be launched in the coming weeks and months. Europe's having a little bit harder time trying to understand how they're going to play in this space. There's difference of opinions. Italy looks at it differently than Norway, than Spain, than Germany. Everybody's trying to figure out how they're going to reassure our friends in Central and Eastern Europe. I think the biggest step that they could do is to come together at the NATO summit in September and offer something very concrete on the partnerships front. Personally, I'd love to see MAP offered for Georgia at that juncture. I think it's highly unlikely. I think there's a lot of resistance to that idea across the NATO alliance, particularly in Western Europe. And so I'm not entirely sure that's within the realm of the possible. But if it's not, I'd like to see NATO having conversations now about what types of partnership initiatives it can put forward at the September summit to send a signal to countries like Georgia, like Moldova, like Bosnia, all of the countries also that are currently members that are feeling uncertain and insecure in this new security environment. And so we'll have to see what we can do on that front together as partners. Lastly, I would say the bottom line is that it's very important that we start to look at a kind of overarching grand strategy. Right now, we're kind of playing with tactics, little maneuvers here and there, but it would be nice for us to come together and have a high-level meeting. We could use the upcoming EU-US summit. The president will be in Europe in just a few days. He'll be traveling to The Hague, Brussels, and Rome. I think failing to use that EU-US summit as an opportunity to put out some messaging but also to generate some fresh ideas on the overarching strategy would be a mistake, and I hope they seize on that opportunity. Fortunately, a lot of EU-US summits tend to be fairly pre-scripted. They know what they're going to say in advance. They deliver, a couple minutes of remarks and everyone heads back home. I hope that's not the case. Again, they really should seize on the opportunity of having Europe settle down with the president in this kind of forum to have a more long-term conversation. So I'll leave it at that. All in all, again, plenty of more work to be done and a really rough start in part because of the blind eye that we had on this corner of the world for so long. But I'm hoping that things will improve as we have greater and greater coordination along the way. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are some of the most actionable recommendations I've seen in a long time dealing with this issue. That was really, really helpful.
Our last speaker is Richard Fontaine. He actually is the president of the Center for American Security, again, right across the street, and a longtime expert on many of these issues. He served as senior advisor and a senior fellow at CNAS before his appointment as president in 2012. Before 2009, for 5 years, he was the foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain, working on these and other issues. He's also worked at the State Department, National Security Council, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I believe you were at the Munich Security Conference, most recent one, so you probably have a good sense of how people are feeling about the U.S. foreign policy in general towards Europe. So please go ahead.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks to Hudson and Ken and to the Hungarian ambassador and everybody who made this session possible. I couldn't have been timelier. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about U.S. policy responses to the crisis in Ukraine. And the first thing I would note is, as some people have, I think, rightly pointed out, this issue in Russia crossing the border into Crimea is also sort of crossed a Rubicon in terms of the U.S. relationship with Russia, the relationship between the transatlantic partners, and where and how the United States and its partners in Europe need to respond. This is an issue, I think, that is bigger than just Crimea. It's bigger than Ukraine, and in fact, it's bigger than just Europe in some ways. The vision for that has been put forth under successive presidents for Europe as a continent that's whole, free, and at peace. The threat now is of a vision by Mr. Putin of a continent, or at least a Russia near abroad, that is divided, unfree, and at perpetual risk. So this is profoundly challenging to what we've been trying to accomplish for a long time. Beyond that, the strength of norms that bar the use of force to seize territory is something that has been an extremely important stabilizing factor in international relations since 1945, and we are seeing this potentially being upended. And so I think that the United States and its partners in Europe need to think very carefully about what their response is going to be, first over the short run, and then over the longer term when it comes to what how Russia's conducted itself. There's been some written recently about Russia sort of having lost no matter what the United States and Europe do. I saw a couple of pieces saying, Putin's already lost the war, so to speak. And I think that my reading is different than this. I think that the response of the United States and Europe is going to be profoundly important to whether Russia is able to consolidate its gains, essentially, in Crimea over the long run or not. I recall in 2008, the Russian invasion of Georgia. There was a lot of talk at the time about imposing costs on Russia for its intervention in Georgia. There was essentially two sort of diplomatic sanctions that were put into place at the time: suspension of the NATO-Russia Council and the U.S. suspended talks on a civilian nuclear agreement. On the case of the NATO-Russia Council, that lasted months, not years, and it was revived. And then in 2010, the United States revived talks on the civil nuclear agreement. What was left is Russia having detached South Ossetia and Abkhazia from Georgia, recognizing this kind of weird independence status, but clearly an allegiance to Moscow, and the Russian government being in violation of the terms it had agreed to under the ceasefire. So essentially what my reading of this is that the West essentially accommodated itself to Russia's willingness to establish facts on the ground through the use of force in Georgia. Now, will Ukraine be different? It may be very different, but it will be different insofar as the United States and Europe respond differently to the intervention in Ukraine than they did to the intervention in Georgia. In terms of the actual policy responses, I think the first objective is to figure out what the objectives are of the United States and Europe, and hopefully try to align those to be as close as possible. In the immediate term, it is to, I would suggest that it's to forestall a Russian advance into eastern Ukraine, avoid the outbreak of violence between Russian forces and Ukrainian military or partisans. I think if the Russians do go into eastern Ukraine, I think they'll find a very different reception than they found thus far in Crimea. You may discover that being greeted as liberators is not as easy a task as some think. I also agree that in Crimea, over the long run, you will have a potential tinderbox kind of situation there, given the mix of the population there. So they had this kind of immediate objectives. Then, to over the longer run, to demonstrate opposition to the forcible changing of borders in Europe. I think there's sort of three elements of policy response that some of which the administration has begun to put into place, and some which still remains a work in progress. I think the first is to resist Russian domination of Crimea and expansion of its military presence in eastern Ukraine. The second is to reinforce the Kiev government through economic aid and diplomatic support. And the third is to reassure our NATO allies who are watching these events with alarm. In the readouts of the conversations that that Mr. Putin had with President Obama and Chancellor Merkel and others, that the Kremlin issued, it was a rather dangerous concept, that a rather dangerous doctrine that Mr. Putin has articulated, which is this right of Russia to intervene militarily to protect not just Russians, but Russian-speaking populations outside its borders. I mean, there are literally tens of millions of Russian speakers living abroad, and so to the extent that this is going to manifest itself as Russian policy, then it threatens to radiate tension and instability in numerous countries. So I think the first task is to orient American policy around non-recognition of Moscow's attempts to establish facts on the ground in opposition to further expansion of the Russian military presence. This means putting into place some of the diplomatic and economic sanctions that have been kind of bandied about. I mean, the G7 statement that came out yesterday, and suspension of the preparatory meeting for the G8 summit should be, I think, just the beginning of that. I agree with Julie. I think it's time for the G7 to reconstitute itself without Russia and drop the idea of the summit in Sochi. Beyond that, I would suggest that the U.S. Congress, as the Senate Foreign Relations Committee yesterday began looking at the possible expansion of the application of the Magnitsky Act sanctions to Russian individuals responsible for the aggression in Ukraine and other financial and diplomatic penalties. As has been pointed out by Julian and others, you know, the bolstering through economic aid, through IMF channels and bilaterally, the government in Kiev will be an important part of this. That, I think, needs to be coupled with a strong message that the new government needs to be inclusive of both its Ukrainian and Russian-speaking populations. And then, in terms of the reassurance piece of this, there needs to be a real robust series of consultations about precisely what kinds of moves would send a message to our partners, our NATO partners in the East, whether it's increased deployments or training exercises and so forth, to demonstrate the credibility of the alliance. I mean, the one way, though, to think about all this is to try to think a couple of moves ahead. And you know, if you're trying to square policy and think of punitive actions toward Russia and resisting its attempts to consolidate its gains or do more, we have to think about what the likely Russian response is going to be to these things. And so that's going to involve contingency planning, for example, to deal with Russia potentially shutting down the northern distribution network where we're getting some of our material out of Afghanistan. General Dunford, the commanding officer in Afghanistan, testified yesterday said yesterday that he didn't expect that to prove you know, particularly onerous. However, it could prove costly to us. we have to think about the reactions of businesses in the United States and in Europe that will, no doubt be averse to seeing sanctions go into place against Russia should we seek that path. And also on the energy front, the contingency planning for Russia using the gas supplies as a lever. So part of the exercise on the policy front is to think about not just what we can do in the immediate term and even over the long term, but how we will respond to the inevitable Russian response to our actions. So that I'll leave it there, and maybe we can get into a discussion.
Thank you so much, Richard. And that's very important to take a great look at the Russia response. I think Andy said you wanted to make a comment in there, perhaps with Russia, and then I'll let you guys contribute what you want. Then we'll go to the audience for questions and answers. So start thinking about Andy. You might want to ask, please.
Thanks, Richard. Actually, what I wanted to point out was something different that I neglected to say in my opening remarks because I was basically still in the angry at Putin mode. Now, the angry at Putin mode it's still there, but I think there's something really there's a core importance to something that we've neglected to say, and that is really what happens on the ground in Ukraine, because it's not what the Europeans do, it's not what the United States does, and it's not even so much what Russia does. But let me just backtrack about this, because it gets at to the kind of the core, I think, sort of misunderstanding between the Russians and certainly the Americans, the Europeans as well, maybe to somewhat of a lesser extent. Okay, why did Putin do this? Okay, one, he was very pissed off. Post-imperial stress syndrome, which has been, fermenting for a while. But I mean, to be serious about it, essentially his Ukraine policy over the last 10 years, which he had invested, even more than 10 years, which he invested a tremendous amount in, had failed with the collapse of the February 21 agreement, which of course the Russians did not sign because they didn't see it as legitimate that the legitimately elected leader, Mr. Yanukovych, should have to leave power soon. But of course, once it's collapsed, then there was the call to, well, let's go back to the status quo ante of the February 21st agreement, which the Americans signed on to, the Europeans signed on to, and we were happy to do so. Were we the ones responsible for the fact that that agreement did not hold? Of course not. There are the forces on the ground. The forces on the ground caused that agreement not to hold up. And frankly, I think the U.S. government would have been very pleased if that agreement had held up, because we wouldn't be in the hornet's nest that we are right now. But when I personally read that agreement on February 21, that included the stipulation that Mr. Yanukovych was going to stay in power for 10 more months as the president of Ukraine, I just said, there's no way that this is going to stick. And the opposition, which obviously includes disparate forces in Ukraine, is going to not agree with this at all. And that happened very quickly, and we saw what took place. And if we go back to the Orange Revolution, in fact, the Russian interpretation, and this has been very, very consistent, from the color revolutions to the Arab Spring, basically any social political uprising in a state in which Russians and Europeans and Americans could contend over, the Russians will emphasize much more the influence of external forces than the indigenous forces on the ground. That is consistent. And it, in my view, absolutely the fundamental factor are those indigenous social, economic, political forces on the ground in the states over which the Russian Federation, over which the European Union, over which the Americans, we are not able to control. Okay? So that's what happened. And Mr. Putin, as usual, is going to kind of overread external forces, or maybe he's just doing this completely cynically to justify something he's wanted to do all this time. I don't know, but you know, that is very, very important, which brings me back to the concerns about, you know, where we are right now, okay? You know, we don't know what the reaction is going to be on the ground on Sunday and afterwards to this referendum. We don't know what the reaction is going to be to any further kind of pressure in eastern, southern Ukraine, or on the, or in Kyiv and or in western Ukraine. So there are a lot of uncontrolled actors by the key external actors that we're talking about that are really going to, at the end of the day, determine what happens. Now, I'm not obviously what the United States does and what the Russian Federation does and the EU and the European states individually do is important, but it's the on the ground that that is going to you know, be the most fundamental factor. And it's again why I get back to my first point. I have just been kind of amazed that so far here we are. It was 2 weeks ago, February 27th, that these military forces arrived, took over the parliament in Simferopol. That was one thing that really pissed me off about the first response on our part. It was already clear that the takeover of the Crimean parliament had been done, and really we didn't think we knew who did that, and I'll leave that at that. But I wanted to point out that it's this uncontrolled forces, and again, you know, people have plans, we have responses, but there are unintended consequences, and there are uncontrollable factors, and so often in history, it's those things that actually make or break the result.
I just have one comment to that. I mean, I think that's an important point. And if you look at, I was in Kiev on the January after the Orange Revolution, and been with a congressional delegation in Crimea the previous summer, and you know, there was a lot of, if you recall the Orange Revolution happening, there was, you know, an immediate kind of American response that we were not going to stand for a stolen election, essentially, the first run of this thing. So we're on the ground speaking with the U.S. Embassy there, and they said, you know, we basically, at the highest levels, you know, made absolutely clear to the Ukrainian government, we will not, you know, the United States does not accept this outcome. And, you know, things changed, and the embassy thought, wow, did this, you know, they listened to us, and then they kind of realized, well, actually, it was just the stuff on the ground that was producing this.
Right.
I mean, that's not to say that, I mean, as I said in my remarks, I mean, the long-term response goes well beyond Ukraine, I think, and that's why it's very important. But you can't discount the reaction of people on the ground and how that's going to affect the domestic politics and the response there, not just the external stuff.
I mean, just to follow, the Yushchenko people were surprised that so many people stayed out for so long.
Yeah.
Okay. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone, and then give your identification, and just remind everybody that this is being recorded, the session.
Again, Natalia Lakiza, US Ukraine Foundation. I have an unanswered question from the previous session, but I will change it a bit, and I would like the panel to answer it if you would like. Yes, international community shown unprecedented support to Ukraine. It did not happen in this century to any independent country. Yes, diplomatic, political, economic in the future, nearest future, yes. But also there is a military activity inside Ukraine, outside of Ukraine, military trainings, bringing forces to Poland, and trainings in Black Sea. Also concentration of Russian army around Ukraine and inside of Crimea and in some parts of Kherson Oblast even. So March 16, referendum, and predictable results that population of Crimea will reunite with Russia. What will be the next step for international community? Will it continue its diplomatic, political actions, or it will be a military activity on this matter? Thank you.
Is it addressed to anybody in particular?
No, to the panel.
Are you going to collect some questions, or do you want to
No,
just do
just
one?
one.
So I don't see a lot of enthusiasm on either side of the Atlantic, or a lot of creative thinking on using the military instrument. In fact, most of the leaders on both sides have indicated that they don't. And in fact, we've heard this, John McCain has said this, I mean, we've heard this from the Hill as well. So certainly from a bipartisan perspective on this side of the Atlantic, I don't see a lot of support for turning to the military instrument. That said, I know that the DASD, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for this corner of the world, Evelyn Farkas, is going to, as soon as she possibly can, she's committed to enhancing defense consultations with her counterparts in Ukraine, and they're working to find dates for that right away. I mean, to Andy's point about this unbelievable restraint that we've seen on the part of the Ukrainian military, which is just, I mean, makes my jaw hang open. It's almost unimaginable. I think part of the reason why we've seen that take place is there has been a remarkable level of cooperation between the West and Ukrainian forces for quite some time. And that, we can't underestimate the importance of that. I don't want the West to credit themselves with anything in this case. What I'm saying is we should value long-term engagement with these types of military forces. We do it with Georgia as well. And in cases when you're facing a crisis, it's absolutely critical that they stay on the right side and they show this kind of restraint. Now, that may not hold. We'll see how events unfold, and if we again see violence erupt somewhere in the country. But even if that were to be the case, again, I don't see NATO responding. I see NATO continuing to provide reassurance through military means. And enhancing training and increasing its presence. We've got AWACS flying over Poland and Romania right now. So more thinking and more initiative on that front, but in terms of actual NATO forces, US forces, European forces showing up in Ukraine, I think that's unrealistic.
Say something?
Yes, please.
First of all, I agree with what Julie said, and also agree with, I mean, with everything that my colleagues have said, but in particular to the grading of our response, because initially we turned Teddy Roosevelt upside down. Yeah. We were talking loudly and carrying no stick, and now we've been matching our words and our rhetoric, our words and our deeds. What's going to happen after the referendum is that the pressure to go, to pull the trigger on much tougher sanctions, it's going to be there, and it's going to happen. I mean, it would have been almost unimaginable, I think, for the EU in particular, obviously because they have a much deeper economic trade and investment relationship with the Russian Federation, and it's very kind of, it's weighted differently in each country. But for it to come to a consensus, it has to be a consensus. Everybody has to sign on. I think we're going to see. I certainly hope, but I think we are going to see tougher set of sanctions from than we would have expected. The effect probably won't be immediately, of course, on the Russian economy, but it will be longer term. On the military issue, yeah, it is accurate that I think that it's unrealistic to expect that suddenly on March 17th NATO is going to have a meeting and give Article 5 security guarantees to Ukraine. But I think one of the things that was a real concern for me if we go back to February 28th and our initial response, is that it seemed that not only President Obama, but everybody who was strongly criticizing President Obama, would start the remarks by, the military option is off the table. And I was like, you know, it's sort of elementary deterrence theory. Why don't we say less, perhaps? And, you know, because you know, Mr. Putin, I think, is a very hard-boiled guy, and he needs to be stared down. But, I mean, there are other things that you can do besides, you know, make an Article 5 commitment. And I was very pleased to see later, because I was like, where the hell are those two ships that were supposedly in the eastern part of the Black Sea that were there in the event that there was a terrorist attack in Sochi or something went bad there? Well, I was embarrassed to find out that, well, one of them actually had run aground trying to go to port in Turkey, and the commander was sacked. But, okay, well, but nevertheless, you know, why don't we send some ships into the Black Sea just to actually to convey the message? Because, you know, why don't we, you know, see that there are higher alert levels on the neighboring NATO member countries of Ukraine? You know, why aren't we seeing initially talk about more planes and overflights to the Baltic Straits, which are the most, of course, obviously nervous about what's happened, and particularly given this the new doctrine of protection of not just ethnic Russians or even Russian speakers, but sochestriki, kind of compatriots.
We have them here too.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, there's a huge diaspora community of them here in the United States. More than 2 million. So, but we've mobilized that relatively quickly, and where I was extremely critical in the first few days, and publicly so, of the Obama administration, I've been much more, I give them much higher grades as Julie does. And I think that we have also, I think, gotten away from this oxymoronic notion of leading from behind, to some extent, at least in this instance. But that's a longer topic. But for me, you know, all right, look, the Bush administration got caught flat-footed with the invasion of South Ossetia in August of 2008. The critical factor was to make sure that all means were were diplomatic, economic, sort of military security, that the message was sent to Mr. Putin that going to Tbilisi was a bridge too far. And that didn't happen. That was good. And the analogy for me here is that Mr. Putin has to understand that going outside of Crimea is a bridge too far. Time will tell.
If I can just comment briefly, I mean, I have I think, a slightly different view than my colleagues, because I don't think that the United States is not going to fight a war with Russia to try to wrest Crimea back, and I really doubt that it will fight a war with Russia even if Russia moves into eastern Ukraine. And I think President Putin knows that. And so I don't know that the signaling that we would try to do is particularly credible. I think we should be doing some things through NATO to reassure our allies. But if we send ships into the Black Sea, is it sending a signal that they're there because they'll shoot at Russian troops that are based in Ukraine, and Putin will be scared of that, and then will think twice about moving on eastern Ukraine because that would precipitate a war between the United States and Russia, or the United States and NATO, or Russia and NATO? I just don't think that that's particularly credible.
You don't think that he would? Well, okay.
John?
We can agree to disagree.
Thank you very much.
Can't agree on that.
John
Yeah.
Sullivan of the Danube Institute.
Boring.
For the last 10 years, 15 really, we've had strategists on both sides of the Atlantic talking about diverging political cultures, with the Europeans being more governed Kantians and the Americans being Hobbesian followers of Mars. And yet, whenever, in the most recent occasions, in Georgia and beginnings of this crisis, it's the Europeans who have been least concerned, it seemed, less concerned rather, about the breaches of international law, the conventions that have underpinned the peace in recent years, and the Americans who've been stronger on this. I was very encouraged by the opening remarks of all the speakers, because you seem to be saying that both sides of the Atlantic were in a sense moving towards each other in the movement towards a stronger and more united and really somewhat tougher response than initially seemed to be the case. Well, first of all, do you think that that is going to continue? So far as political cultures have diverged, is there some long-term actions we can take to bring them together? And finally, does Central Europe, is Central Europe different in this respect? And if it is, and if it is closer to the American view, and I think it is, how can we encourage that, and what use can we make of it in intra-alliance councils?
So, I think this is an interesting time for the transatlantic relationship in terms of how they look at their toolkit, how they look at grand strategy. And in many ways, they're facing a lot of the same challenges back at home. So you've got two sides of the Atlantic that feel incredibly constrained by the era of austerity, right? So we've got just blanket resource constraints. We don't necessarily feel like we can do as much as we used to be able to do. And in Europe, in particular, on the defense side, this plays out in a much more dramatic way with declining defense budgets, but we've seen it here too, but also cuts to development assistance just across the board. So that's factor number one. Factor number two is we now see polling data on both sides of the Atlantic where we've got publics that are war-weary, they're exhausted, questions about the utility of military force, questions about post-conflict reconstruction, our ability to rebuild a country like Afghanistan, kind of limping away from Afghanistan/Iraq, drawing different sets of lessons. In some cases, we see instances where folks are leaning quite dramatically towards retrenchment. And then you pair that with huge domestic priorities, a huge list of domestic priorities that distract us, that draw our attention, that keeps our finance ministers focused on those domestic priorities versus foreign policy priorities. We've got elections. The EU is going to be facing some changes in leadership. NATO is going to be having a new Secretary General. I mean, it's a very transformative landscape for both sides of the Atlantic. And so they're both facing some kind of broad existential questions about kind of the role of US European leadership, where does the liberal order sit as we see rising powers, either rise and then fall or rise a little bit and not as much as we expected. But broad questions about our ability to promote democracy and human rights overseas. And so there are just deep existential questions that I think has led us both down a path where we're just a little bit more hesitant and gun-shy on any international issue. And we've seen this play out just across multiple regions. And so I think in the case of Ukraine, you're seeing it play out as well. I mean, I've had interesting conversations with Europeans in the last 2 weeks where some have said, look, we're kind of with you. We want to have something with teeth, but this is a really tough time for us. We have national elections coming up. If we go too far in supporting the Ukrainian government or too far with sanctions, that's going to hurt us. We're going to have these far right or whatever they're worried about, some extreme party coming in. And so there's just this deep anxiety that's kind of casting the shadow over the dialogue. So while I think that we've done all right in coming together over the last 2 weeks, I do, to your point about what comes next, I do worry about divisions that will resurface because the choices will get harder. So one thing, for example, we could look at, and this is where you're going to see considerable friction, is do we look at the question of military sales to Russia? You do have French delivery of an LHD scheduled for next year. So do we want to have a conversation about that, about whether or not the Mistral should show up in Russian hands? Obviously the French perspective right now is too soon to have that conversation, but we may get there, right? And then as we get through the low-hanging fruit on sanctions, targeted sanctions are one thing, but I guarantee you, and I know for a fact that the administration here in Washington is much more eager to take that to the next level. With blanket sanctions, it doesn't necessarily will be a list of 20, but they really want to take it to the next level. When will Europe be prepared to do that, and to what degree? We've heard some encouraging signals, but I think it could get complicated. And then, as I noted at the NATO summit, there's going to be a lot of friction there. Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, our partners in that corner of Europe are very keen to see innovation, initiative on the partnership front. I think a lot of Washington agrees with that. It's clear Western Europe does not. And we could be leading up to a summit where there'll be not so helpful public debates about this, again, that show that wedge between Central and Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and Washington. That Putin just relishes it. I mean, he loves to see stuff like that. And the more in disarray we appear, the better it is for him. So, so to your question about kind of what we're in for in the weeks and months ahead, assuming this continues to spiral out of control, or even if we just stay in status quo, I think the potential for transatlantic disagreement is pretty great. We've learned some lessons. I think we're getting a little bit smarter about how we handle this, but I do see trouble on the horizon.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Andrew, you mentioned that Crimea depends entirely on drinking water and electricity on Ukraine.
Yeah.
I don't know how far the sources of this go back in Ukraine, but aren't you afraid that maybe Putin can use a new pretext to go into that area by saying that someone wants to cut off, even though the Ukrainians have said that they will not?
Yes.
Quick one.
We already had some Central Asian countries threaten war over water access.
Yes, it can cut both ways.
I think we have some
Does
questions.
it look real right now for you?
Excuse me?
Does it look real danger right now for you?
The danger that Russia would use a pretext to do something similar beyond the borders of Crimea, to me, has been a real danger on burning a hole in the front lobe of my brain. Yes, and there are, we could spend, kind of 2 hours or more kind of going into it, but absolutely. And we have to understand, because there has been a consistent, now 14 years of underestimating Mr. Putin, both on the domestic political front and on the international front. And for him, this is a vital interest as he sees it. And and as the majority of the Russian people see it as well. Not necessarily the reconstitution of the Soviet Union, but let's go back to 1990 and think about the extremely popular short book that Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote about the vision of a kind of Eurasian Union that would include essentially Ukraine, Belarus, northern Kazakhstan, and the Russian Federation. So he is focused on this like a laser beam. And he has obviously displayed the capacity to think, 2 or 3 steps ahead of us. And I don't know whether and how he can actually be deterred. But I do know that as Richard put it, that a military conflict in Ukraine, it's not going to be a 5-day war. And the repercussions from that are going to be huge, and they're going to be long-lasting, and some of them are probably unimaginable, I think, as we sit here today.
questions in the back, so keep your hand up.
Paul Kamar with the American Hungarian Federation. When this crisis started to unfold, President Obama addressed the nation and said that any military intervention in Ukraine by Russia would not be in the interest of Ukraine, Russia, or Europe. And notably absent from those carefully prepared remarks is any interest of the United States, let alone making any reference to the Budapest Memo and Article 5 and so forth. And then his recent meeting with the Prime Minister, he talked about the right of self-determination, which some Russian sympathizers to say, well, Crimea used to be part of Russia, and we're now having a referendum to determine our self-determination. So my question is the administration doing a good enough job of articulating our interests to the American people?
All right, I'll start, and then, I mean, you know, if you're advising, you know, Julie and I both worked on the NSC staff, and if you're advising a president, what you don't like to see is the president go out there and basically to the world publicly announce a red line or a red light and then see that red light gone through in less than 24 hours, right? Okay, so if they could get that one back, my guess is they probably would do that one a little bit differently. You know, that's why I said before, I think the first task here is to lay out what precisely the American objectives are, or the American interests here, and why they're bigger than just Crimea, they're bigger than just Ukraine, they're bigger even than just Europe. We have to, I think the administration has to kind of walk the line between, you know, talking about the sort of international law and norms aspects without getting too legalistic about this, because there's some danger that this becomes kind of a legal exercise, and the Russians say, well, okay, but Kosovo, you didn't have a UN Security Council resolution, didn't stop you from going to war, and, you know, so, you know, when international law is on your side, you want to use it. When it's on our side, we'll use it. You know, so there's a balance to be had here, but this needs to be articulated, I think, in both local, regional, and international terms in the language of interests as well as legality.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's also complicated by the fact that Putin's so slippery and is going to argue this, 50 times backwards and forwards, but, he's also talking about, well, Yanukovych gets up and says, I'm in charge, I'm still in power, I'm dictating the following, I'm putting in this, I'm not standing in Kiev, but, Putin has this connective tissue to Yanukovych, and they'll play it out as, well, this isn't an infringement of Crimea's territorial sovereignty, as the administration has noted, but in fact, this is a humanitarian mission at the request of someone I see to be still in power. So, I mean, I think Richard's right. It's like, it's hard to write this for a broad audience and in a few minutes, go through the legalese of it and explain the history of it and then outline U.S. interests. And I mean, I think the president has been out quite a bit. I know they're trying to see what they could do to get as much joint international engagement on this. I mean, I'd like to see some joint transatlantic statements, more Europeans and Americans standing shoulder to shoulder, and there'll be opportunities to do that obviously on the president's upcoming trip, but I want to see more messaging done from Europe and the United States, because I think it's much more powerful when we stand together.
Just a quick comment, because it kind of combines answers to both questions, or your earlier question, because I mean, it gets back to Julie's first point, I think, that, I mean, we have been kind of operating under the assumption that European security has been more or less resolved. And to suddenly have it put in our right smack dab in our face in this way is, it's hard to deal with. And I've never been inside the government, but I can always have sympathy for people, who are working, 18, 20-hour days probably, on the phones and watching every piece of information to try to coordinate everything. Having said that, I think that and this is, Richard talked about this some, and I think Julie too, sometimes less is more. actually, less talk from the president out front, and maybe more quieter engagement through channels. We know that is going, and it's interesting to see, for example, how we're trying to work with those that have some contact or different kind of relationship with Mr. Putin, whether it is Kazakhstan, who Mr. Nazarbayev was in Moscow and met with Mr. Putin and Lukashenko in a customs union meeting last Monday, and there was a statement from, an official statement from Kazakhstan that emphasized the inviolability of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. That's important. Obviously, China is the big kahuna in this, and where they go, and they're walking a very thin line. It is going to be interesting to see, how the opportunity is used in less than 2 weeks when for the nuclear security meeting in The Hague, where Mr. Obama is scheduled to be. Mr. Putin is supposed to be there. The chances that he shows up, slim to none, I would think. So probably Mr. Medvedev or Mr. Lavrov, but Mr. Nazarbayev will be there. Other leaders will be there. That's an opportunity also to have those kinds of conversation. But I think it's hard for us to kind of come up with the sort of doctrinal, view of this is the new thing for European security when we're in the thick of the crisis and we don't know how this is going to end, and you got to be spending 99% of your time simply trying to put the fire out with every tool possible.
Of course, we've run into this problem before of our anticipating peace in Europe only to be shattered. I mean, 100 years ago, or even closer, I remember in early 1990s, the Cold War was over. We thought we were home free, but wars broke out in the former Yugoslavia. Then there was Georgia, which came out of nowhere. We thought those conflicts were frozen, and then we realized how they can be unfrozen quickly.
It's that image of the fog of war.
So what we want European
well,
peace,
but we're kind of in a fog right now. That's the scary thing.
The gentleman at his hand back, please.
Ken Meyer for Rule. As the Crimea was under Russian rule for 200 years before it was turned over or joined with Ukraine just 60 years ago, and not through the wishes of the people of Crimea, but through a high-level agreement, why shouldn't we look on the return of Crimea to Russian suzerainty as resolution of an anomaly?
That would have been a lot easier to do before a military occupation than a call for an election while Crimea is being occupied militarily by Russian military forces. That's kind of what goes back to my first comment, that Mr. Putin has taken things to the point where he makes choices for us extremely limited. I think that one could easily imagine a path where that could have happened, over a period of several months after you have elections in Kyiv with a different government, and where there are negotiations all along the way. But this has just put it in a much more complicated context. Probably
Well, and President Putin has become the champion of self-determination of minorities in other countries. So I'm waiting for the Chechen referendum for secession from Russia, and how he would respond to that, or Ingushetia, or any of these other regions. So I'm still in kind of the waiting pattern.
Any last question? If not, please join me in thanking the panelists, and we'll break for 20 minutes.